Back tonight, John in Focus. Investigators at Open Secret have warned that the Zondo Inquiry's alleged failure to point out the banking industry and other middlemen in the state capture may undo future work against corruption. Open Secrets and Shadow World Investigations jointly submitted an exhaustive investigative report to the Commission on the matter in 2020. They now contend that the inquiry and its report only play lip service to their work. For more on this, we are now joined by Open Secret Investigations, Marchant. Michael, good afternoon and thank you very much for your time. In essence, the matter you're raising is the fact that in 2020, as Open Secret, you sent this report to the Zondo Commission in a form of an investigative report. The enablers, the banks, accountants and lawyers that cashed in on state capture. Now you have put together a piece which is in the Daily Maverick. Firstly, why did you put together that piece? What did you want to communicate in that piece?
So I think, good evening, Thabo, and good evening to those that are watching. I think what we wanted to communicate in this latest piece is that, while the Zondo Commission has done an extraordinary amount of work, traversed huge instances of corruption across the state and tried to unpack across, over 5,000 pages of analysis of what happened with state capture. And what the Commission set out to do was explain to us what happened, but also I think what it said is that it wanted to explain to us how it happened. And our argument at Open Secrets and Shadow World Investigations is that you don't have state capture and you don't have grand corruption without quite a sophisticated money laundering system that allows those who are complicit in corruption to extract their money, move it around the world, and then ultimately to benefit from the proceeds of their crimes. They need the banking system and other professionals to enable them to do this. And so we really wanted the Commission to dedicate, I think, a bit more time to explaining that system, but also to holding those actors to account and to grilling them in public, subpoenaing them, forcing them to appear at the Commission, I think would have been important. And I think that it's a significant gap in in the Commission's work, ultimately.
Yeah. Now you say inexplicably a full and energetic interrogation of the private actors and particularly banking sector was largely missing from the Commission's work. Do you think this can be explained away by the limitations that were brought by the scope that was given to the Commission in terms of the terms of reference? But also, I mean, in the final part of the report, the Commission chair is saying at some point he had to make recommendations because if we were to continue investigating, this would have gone longer than the year that it has, and maybe even the billion rands that has been spent on it.
Look, it's certainly true, I think, that the Commission eventually had to draw a line under certain things. And there were also all sorts of allegations that were made during the hearings that ultimately the Commission was never going to be able to do it all. However, I think in the case, particularly when it comes to the banking sector and the money flows, the Commission had a dedicated money flows investigative team led by investigators and evidence leaders that were looking at that evidence. And the Commission did, and this in fact is an important point to note, is the Commission did include an entire separate report running to well over 100 pages in its volumes that explained the money laundering. And so it wasn't that the Commission didn't look at all at how this had happened. I think the real gap was in its critique of the system and in particular around the nature of the recommendations. And so we have at the end of this multi-year process, we have the Commission coming out and saying, yes, it's very clear that money laundering took place on a massive scale. The Financial Intelligence Center should try and work out, for example, what happened. But the Commission is asking the FIC to look into something that we, quite forcefully told the Commission to look into all those years ago. And I don't think it would have been completely outside of the scope of what the Commission was already working on to include some of those questions in its own work.
Maybe because of time, let's confine ourselves, for example, to one example that you point out, the Estina dairy farm. There are a number of others, of course, that you're pointing to. Why you believe that, for example, the kind of corruption that went on with this matter of Estina dairy farm would not have been possible without the enablers, the banks, the accountants, the lawyers, etc., etc.
Estina is a great case, and I think it's a great case study because the money laundering was so egregious. In that instance, we had all the red flags, I think, for money laundering were ticked. We have Estina, the South African company, connected to the Guptas receiving huge amounts of money from the Free State government, purportedly for an agricultural project. And then within days of receiving that money, sending it out in equal installments over a number of days, for example, often to the UAE and to companies that had no connection whatsoever to agriculture. They also, FNB and Standard Bank, not only facilitated those payments, but in some cases, FNB were even facilitating those transfers after Estina's contract had been cancelled by the government. And so that's a perfect example where we think the banking system, together with the banking regulators, should have been able to intervene much earlier in order to stop the money, for example, from being externalized. And maybe the last point, which is quite an important point, is one of the reasons this is so important is the need for the South African state now to pursue all the assets that were stolen through state capture. And that is made extraordinarily difficult by the fact that the banks allowed that money to be removed from the country on the scale that they did.
Yeah. Looking forward then, how do we rectify this? I mean, do you believe maybe bodies like the NPA should certainly be giving a second squeeze at this report that you gave to the Commission, and this would be helpful in them pursuing the kind of cases that they need to deal with now?
I certainly think so. I think that the financial intelligence sector, the Reserve Bank, and the NPA should be working together to look at whether any of these actors indeed might be criminally liable. And if not, they need to be looking at how to fix the current system to ensure that money laundering isn't allowed on this type of scale. And then I think the other thing is that they need to engage the authorities in other countries, such as the United Kingdom, Hong Kong, the UAE, to engage them about holding the banks in those countries accountable, but also to get mutual legal assistance so that it's easier for them to track the assets of state capture.
Yeah. Do you think maybe even going forward there should be a broader conversation in South Africa, maybe with the Auditor General and all those bodies, exactly to the kind of scrutiny that banks should be held accountable for, the kind of destruction that we see even in our municipalities and so on going forward, because they are playing in that space and they are seeing these monies going back and forth, and there should maybe be even early warning signs that are built into those systems and into those accounts.
Absolutely. And currently by law, the banks are required to report suspicious transactions. And I think one of the concerns that we certainly have is whether banks are happy to sit back, fulfill their requirement to report, but then not act on any of the things that they're seeing. And if you look back again at state capture, it's a very good example, is that the banks came out very strongly when they closed the Gupta accounts to say we're allowed to act where we suspect that something strange or dodgy is going on. And yet for years, they saw the transactions taking place, even after a lot of the corruption was being ventilated in the media, and they were aware potentially of some of these transactions. Arguably, banks are only acting at the moment when they fear there's a reputational risk. And up until then, they're happy to facilitate the transfers and, of course, to make an extraordinary amount of money out of that until the point at which they deem the risk too great. And I think it is high time that the authorities really scrutinize that. And also, I think, come back to the public and explain how the system has gone wrong and for how long, and the urgent steps that are going to be taken to rectify it.
Michael, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on. That's Michael Marchant. He is head of investigations at Open Secret there. And that piece, of course, in the Daily Maverick, making a case for the banks, the accountants, and the other enablers to also be looked into quite closely